I do appreciate our newspaper bringing common sense to Common Core meeting. And why I appreciate that is because two things. I hope you did bring your common sense, because I want you to listen. And this is factual information. I want you to form your own opinions. We're not here to tell you what you need to believe. We're here to present information. The second thing is, and typically what happens in politics, what we've seen throughout the years, is when someone doesn't have factual information to counter you, they start calling you crazy. So understand, this is factual information.
As Michael said, I'm a grandmother. I am the grandmother of a granddaughter who read The Bluest Eye last year. And I will tell you about that. So it's happening in Mississippi. So I'll tell you about those circumstances. But, you know, we're all about one thing. We have one thing in common. We love our children. We love our state. And we want the very best for our educational system. We don't always see eye to eye on everything, and that's okay. That's human nature. But we need to come together as a community, as a state, and really honestly look at issues and say what's best. And not be afraid to turn away when we've made a bad choice. I personally believe that Common Core is a bad choice. I began researching this earlier this year because a friend of mine was sitting with me in the gallery at the House of Representatives, and she stays there all the time when they're in session. She said, I'm too busy. I have got to have time for research. Common Core has got a lot of alarm bells, and I just don't know enough. I need to do more research. I said, Laura, I'll do your research for you. And that's when it all started. One of the first things I looked at was a research paper that was done for the Pioneer Institute by Emmett McGroarty and Jane Robbins. They're with the American Principles Project. And it's called Controlling Education from the Top Down, Why Common Core is Bad for America. And it's a very well done paper. And I talked to Emmett McGroarty on the phone for about an hour and a half back in May. He said, you use that paper and that information however you want to, because this is too important. I don't have any claim to it. You take it and use it however you want to. So that began my research. And as Michael said, I've always tried to use very credible resources. There's a lot of stuff out there, but I want to know that what I'm telling you is absolutely factual. And it can be relied on. We all know, I think by now, that Common Core refers to a set of K-12 educational standards in math and English language arts, which were adopted in Mississippi in 2010. The Common Core science standards are called Next Generation Science. They were released this year in the spring, but my understanding is Mississippi has no intent to adopt those. I think a good summary statement to start with is made by a lady called Diane Ravitch. She's a research professor at New York University, an education historian, an author, and she worked for the U.S. Department of Education under George H.W. Bush and under Bill Clinton. You know, politically, she's more liberal than I am, but that's okay. She and I see eye to eye on Common Core. And here's what she said in February. She said, I've been an agnostic about this subject for a couple of years, but I finally decided I can't support Common Core. After much deliberation, I've come to the conclusion I can't wait 5 or 10 years to find out whether test scores go up or down, and whether or not kids in schools are improving, or whether kids are far behind and worse off. I've come to the conclusion the Common Core Standards effort is fundamentally flawed by the process with which it was foisted on the nation. And including in that process is the fact that there was no field testing. There's no empirical data about Common Core. You can't imagine the Federal Drug Administration launching a new drug without field testing, but that's what happened. We're going to talk about some fundamental flaws in Common Core. It's flawed in its vision, in the way it was developed, and how it was adopted, and in some federal issues. Benchmarking for success is really kind of the beginning of this standards effort, because it was a research paper that was done by Achieved Incorporated, which is an entity of the National Governors Association. And when it was published, they laid out some action steps for educational reform. Upgrading state standards by adopting a Common Core of internationally benchmarked standards, leverage states' collective influence to ensure that textbooks, curricula, media assessments are aligned to the standards, revise state policies for recruiting, preparing, developing, and supporting teachers and school leaders to reflect human capital practices. I stop right there on that bolded words, human capital. Repeatedly in my research, I come across that term, human capital, or workforce development, or things like that. And what they were talking about is our children and grandchildren. I mean, I don't think of my grandchildren as human capital. They're created in the image of God for His purpose. And they are gifted by Him uniquely for His purpose. I don't want the government or the school system or anybody else, however well intended, to think of them in terms of human capital for workforce development.
That's a communist. Yep. That's a communist term.
Okay, and the last two things are to hold schools and school systems accountable for recruiting, preparing, developing, and supporting teachers, school leaders, and then accountable through monitoring and interventions. And this paper was funded by the Gates Foundation. They have quite a bit of money, if you've been looking into it, into the Common Core effort. Some concerns about the Common Core development process is that it was not driven by K through 12 educators. Only 2 of the 29 people on the team developing the standards were not associated with an education company, which means an education company, a consulting company, somebody that produces materials, they all have money in it. So 27 of the 29 were associated with entities that had money in education reform. No teachers and only a few professors were on the standards development team. As I said, there was no field testing, and states have no rights to the standards. The copyrights are owned by the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers. They can't be changed, they can't be deleted. So if you have a gripe with what a standard says and you go to your school administration, they're incapable of having any effect over it. Same is for the State Board of Education. They belong to the NGA and the CCSSO. The standards development team for English Language Arts was led by David Coleman with Student Achievement Partners, Susan Pimentel also with Student Achievement Partners, and a senior consultant with Achieve. Student Achievement Partners was an entity formed by Coleman and Susan and Jason Zimba, and the only job they ever did was Common Core, paid $6.5 million by the Gates Foundation to do that job. And I want to introduce you to a few players in this whole effort, starting with David Coleman. And this is important because none of these things are ever done in a vacuum. Education reform, programs, projects, initiatives, they all come from somebody's value system, somebody's ideas, somebody's principles. It's all in somebody's mind. So who's leading these things? What's it trickling down from? David Coleman, Andy Smerrick is a Republican. He's an education policy expert. He worked in the Federal Department of Education, and he says of Coleman, he's in a position to tie what kids are learning to what colleges are expecting. Very few people in America today are having a bigger influence on what kids are learning than David Coleman. He's a Rhodes Scholar, Oxford educated. His majors were in English literature and philosophy. When he finished college, he applied for a job in New York City public schools and was not hired. He was turned down for the job, so he went into education consulting. He's considered the lead architect for Common Core standards. I have a resource sheet over there if you're interested in picking up one. It gives some links to a number of articles that kind of substantiate and back up some of the things I'm saying. And you would find on there an interview where he talked about President Obama and defended what he said in his campaign in 2008 when he called Pennsylvanians clinging to their guns and their Bibles. So from those kinds of speeches that he's given, it's clear that he's an idealist, a social reformer. Most people who know him say that's true, and he's now president of the College Board, which is responsible for the SAT test. The math standards team, the lead writers were Jason Zimba, who I just mentioned, the old friend of David Coleman, Phil Darrow, who's with America's Choice. America's Choice is an education company that is owned by Pearson Publishing now. And then William McCallum, who's also a consultant with Achieve. Who owns the standards? The NGA, as I mentioned, DC-based trade association. They have no legislative authority over states. They say on their website that all governors are members, but in fact there are several governors who are not members who have said they don't think it's a good way to spend taxpayer money on membership dues. It really doesn't help them. and so they're not members. 80% of their funding comes from taxpayers, either through federal grants and federal monies or through those state dues. The Council of Chief State School Officers also owns the copyright. They're also a trade group. Interestingly, it's hard to find out a lot about them because their meetings are closed. They don't publish any of their minutes. But apparently you pay dues based on whatever committees that you're involved in, whichever ones you choose to be on. The more committees, the more you pay. Common Core is really flawed in its development. There's a standards feedback team. The development team we just talked about, but there's a feedback team that looks at what they're drafting and gives them feedback. It's their job to provide research and advice to these standards developers. They're mostly professors on that team, only one math teacher. And a number of them had testified that they felt like that their input was really not taken seriously, or it was not reflected in the final product. A number of them said they used the Delphi method for handling this project. If you're not familiar with that, what it really means is you have a stated project, you bring a bunch of people together and you say, we're going to work on this together, we're going to solve this. But in fact, the core facilitators already have in mind the end game. And they are just facilitating things to get to the end they already know about. And I found this article published yesterday on Education Week's blog. And it is an English teacher from Florida named Anthony Cody. He actually, he writes that he was, in 2009, asked by the Florida Education Association to join a group of teachers from several states to review the draft for these college and work readiness standards. And so he was glad to do that. He and his colleague Renee Caldwell traveled to Washington for a series of meetings. They returned in 2011 for the American Federation of Teachers Institute to design the support for the rollout of the Common Core standards. Anthony writes he assumed the Common Core language arts writers would have been working closely with the National Council of Teachers of English. So he called to learn how to best support their contribution at the standards review and was surprised to learn that that entity had not been working with them. And as the review unfolded, it became apparent that they were not working, as Anthony says, with a holistic, integrated application of standards. To Renee and me, it began to look instead like a checklist forming a platform for standardized testing. This worried me because, as we've seen again and again, overdependence on testing works against creative professional teaching methods. So Anthony was asked, was your input respected and incorporated in meaningful ways? He answers, my input was politely heard. I vaguely recall some wording and some tweaks, but my main issue, that the standards could be a guide to be used creatively and professionally rather than another big accountability list, wasn't really part of the agenda. They were friendly and welcoming, sent me a warm letter. I'm loyal to the union, but I felt that they overly managed from above. This was the next wave of corporate education reform. I had been naive to think I could somehow make a difference in a larger sense. And finally, he says, so on my own, I began to dig deeper. Today I urge the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association leaders to change course, back away from the standards, and help expose their harmful characteristics. You need to know this guy too. Mark Tucker was on the feedback team. He's president of the National Center for Education and Economy. He does not have an education degree or a business management degree. He taught 2 semesters in junior college. He came to Mississippi in 2011 to speak to the Commission on Teacher Accreditation and Certification for the State Department of Education. He was introduced as an educator and author. And I think that's a stretch, really, based on his experience in the classroom and his education to call him that much of an educator. He's very famous for his Dear Hillary letter. Back when Bill Clinton was elected the first time after his victory, Mark Tucker wrote Hillary Clinton a letter to let her know, it's an 18-page letter, his outline for education reform. It lays out a vision of the kind of national, not federal, human resources development system. It's been introduced in the congressional record, so you can go Google it and read the whole 18 pages if you want to. But the Eagle Forum, which is working very, very hard, and you know that's a conservative policy group against Common Core, has described Mark Tucker's plan in these words. Designed on the German system, the Tucker Plan is to train children in specific jobs to serve the workforce and the global economy, instead of to educate them so they can make their own life choices. Which brings me back to the theme, my grandchild, is a gift from God. And he needs to be able to make his own life choices. Another flaw is in the adoption. The fact that it was state-led or voluntary is what we hear over and over and over again. But I would say to you, the fact that those entities, the National Governors Association, has no legislative authority is the first thing that really bothers me about that. The other thing is states adopted Common Core standards as a result primarily of applying for Race to the Top funds. In 2009, the Obama stimulus package set aside $4.35 billion for education, and Arne Duncan put it to the Race to the Top federal grant program. And when you apply for those grants, you have a better chance of getting No Child Left Behind waivers. That was another incentive. In March of 2010, President Obama made some speeches about this movement, and in March 2010 is when the draft of the standards came out. So in some of his speeches, he actually tied Title I funds to it, letting states know you want to protect your Title I funds, you really need to get on board with this reform movement. And there was a very narrow time frame at that time for states to adopt them. The first period to apply for Race to the Top funds was November 2009 to January 2010. 2 months. And schools were not in session over a holiday period. There was no legislature in session, so it was kind of flying under the radar. And states had to react very quickly. Mississippi applied in the second application period, June to August 2010. Again, no legislature in session, and schools in a summer mode. Andy Smarik again says the states were so desperate for money they were willing to just do it. So many states signed on so fast with a push from the federal government, there wasn't a fuss until now. The things that you agreed to when you applied for Race to the Top sound an awful lot like the benchmarking for success criteria. To develop and adopt the common standards, develop and adopt high-quality assessments, align to the standards, participate in a testing consortium. Mississippi is in PARC, the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Career. Originally, there were 25 states in that PARC consortium. As there's more and more coming out about Common Core and more concern, a number of states have pulled out of that consortium. It's now down to 14 plus the District of Columbia. And then we agreed that teacher and principal performance and evaluations would be based on how things go with the Common Core standards rollout. Some of the alarm bells that we really have as citizens are the constitutional issues, the parental rights, the privacy issues, the social reform, and the fact that the costs for Common Core are unknown versus these unknown results. There are a couple of congressional acts that are being undermined by this effort. The General Education Provision Act prohibits the Department of Education from having any control over education, curriculum, instruction, administration, any of those things. FERPA protects the privacy. Your children's information cannot be released without parental consent. However, in 2010, the year of the rollout of the standards, the Department of Education made an executive change just by writing out a regulation that now allows disclosure without the consent of parents to school officials with legitimate educational interests. When you read that regulation, you find that school officials is very broadly defined, so is educational interests. This is Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. You can find on ed.gov a letter that he's written to the Council of Chief State School Officers in June of this year, because we're coming up on the time frame for the assessments. And there's a lot of angst with districts about testing, moving from the old testing methods to the new Common Core. How do we do this? We're going to double test. So in this letter, he addresses some of their concerns. And there are a couple of things he said that just really fly all over me constitutionally. He says the Department of Education is open to additional flexibility for states in one particular element of teacher and leader evaluation. So my question is, if Common Core standards and assessments are not federally mandated programs, why and how is the federal government able to offer flexibility to states? The other thing he says in this long letter, given the dramatic changes in curriculum teachers and principals are now starting to teach, the transition and new assessments aligned to those standards, the department will, on a state-by-state basis, allow states up to 1 additional year before using their new evaluation systems to inform personnel decisions. So I'd like to know exactly what evaluation systems to inform personnel determinations, what does that mean to the state of Mississippi? What federal role do they have in evaluating our teachers? Another alarm bell is parental rights. There's a very good website, parentalrights.org, if you've not discovered it. It's working hard in this area. And they sum up that the federal government has used taxpayer monies to coerce the states into adopting these standards. And then not one citizen elected legislative body has had any input into the standards or the system of development by which those standards came to be. The Pioneer Institute sums it up as well. The states no longer have control over education, neither can the parents in those states. The best way to stop the scheme is for individual states to refuse to participate. Parental rights. I would urge you to go to YouTube and search Charlie Rose - Arnie Duncan. And you will hear the Secretary of Education talk about his vision of what he thinks education ought to be in America. Things like 12 to 14-hour school days year-round. Schools become the center of our community, and that is a quote. Groups like the YMCA, boys clubs, sports clubs, all their services ought to be integrated into the school system. If you thought it takes a village to raise a child was scary, this is scary. Preschool for All is President Obama's preschool program, and the parts of it, the principal parts of it, mirror very much what we're doing right now with Common Core, with a focus on 3 to 5-year-olds, calls for longitudinal data systems for daycares and preschools, race to the top grants, partnership with Health and Human Services that would include an emphasis on home visits, and then common standards. When these standards were put out in draft form in March 2010, the Alliance for Childhood Education published a petition-like letter signed by 115 child psychologists, ministers, and educational experts in preschool, in which they called on the National Governors Association not to publish these standards. They were very clear in their professional opinion that they would be stressful and harmful psychologically to young children. But of course, they were ignored. Another alarm is privacy. The data mining can happen through the statewide longitudinal data systems, which Mississippi does have, which means, I understand we have 90 points of data on a child that's in the public school system from the time they enter. And some of those points of data might be troubling to parents because they include things like behavioral problems and family income and maybe some political things and religious things, more than just the normal data. Privacy issues also are there in the digital assessments. PARC Consortium got $170 million from Gates and in federal funds to set up that assessment system. And the thing about the data is, now that they have a contract with PARC, with the Department of Education, that is their gateway to get that private information, even though constitutionally they're not supposed to have access to it. I will tell you that David Coleman is a big proponent of data. There's a short video, and I think I have a link to it on there, that you could listen to him talk about the importance of data, and that he would like to hire the same people that President Obama used to build some data for education so that we can train American children on advocacy and policy. And he sees that we need to he sees how they mobilized millions of voters in that campaign and how effective that was. And it could be a great tool, he thinks, for the College Board to build their educational data and a mobilization team as well. We'll skip that because Angela may talk about grit, tenacity, and perseverance. And we talked about what David Coleman says about data. I would tell you that Mary Graybar is an English teacher at Emory University in Georgia, and she's a conservative. Her parents immigrated from Europe. She came here for freedom and liberty. and she's very concerned about Common Core. She says, as a classroom teacher, standards and curricula in the real world of the classroom have very little difference in meaning. So, you know, when you keep hearing the argument that, oh, we're still controlling curricula, the standards drive the curricula, so do the assessments. And she says that's why there's a big rush on to buy Common Core compliant textbooks across the country. You know some of the alarm bells we've seen about curriculum. We know that there's an advanced placement textbook on human geography called Cultural Landscapes. It has quite a long chapter on teaching Islam and doesn't give much to Christianity and Judaism. But it's been done in Tennessee classrooms, and that's an actual poster of the 5 pillars of Islam that was on a high school wall in Tennessee. There are a number of books that are text exemplars for high school reading in English language arts that are very concerning because they degrade marriage and the family. In the Time of Butterflies is one that I have, that I've been reading. It's pretty left-leaning, it's overtly feminist, it's sexually explicit. It portrays men as weak drunkards and cheats on their wives. It's about the revolution in Cuba, and it never takes into effect that Fidel and Raul were terrorists or tyrants and that Che Guevara was a murderer. The Bluest Eye, I heard somebody talking about that. As you know, it's full of rape, incest, and pedophilia, and the story is told from the perspective of the perpetrator, so that the author kind of tries to develop some sympathy for that person. Yes, in Northwest Rankin High School last year, my granddaughter, as an 11th grader, was given the choice of 2 books to read. One of them was The Bluest Eye. And they didn't have any trouble finding it, and the jacket cover looked okay enough, so that's the one they bought and started reading. My daughter reads everything my granddaughter reads. They got into that book, and ooh boy, it was not pretty. They had to have a mother-daughter talk.
It's told from the point of view of...
That's what I understand.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's what I understand.
the rapist.
Yeah. There's another one.
You have to have sympathy.
Yeah, you do. There's another one called Dreaming in Cuban. It's sexually explicit. It talks about teen sex. But the mother who tries to counsel, correct, discipline this teenage daughter about these things is then portrayed as insane, and the father is portrayed as abusive. So, not pretty. There's an advanced placement text in U.S. history that falsely interprets the Second Amendment. It says that we have the right to keep and bear arms when serving in a state militia. We all know that's not true. That's not the way it is. If you're familiar with David Barton, Wall Builders Ministry, have you heard of him? I've seen a video where he testifies about this and the fact that Common Core standards do not call for the teaching of cursive writing. When he was in college, he took a constitutional course, and his instructor said some things about the Constitution that didn't sit well in his spirit. He said, you know, that doesn't sound right to me. He went back and found a copy of the original handwritten document so he could see for himself what the Constitution says. And he understood then that it wasn't exactly right, that he was right to check on that because he was being told something that wasn't exactly right. But he makes the point that when you cut our children off from knowing how to read and write in cursive, you have cut them off from their heritage, the founding documents of this country. It is about social reform. In the Bryant School District in Arkansas, 6th graders were assigned, and you've probably heard about this one, an assignment to pretend that you're on a committee to rewrite the Bill of Rights because it's outdated. So you need to choose 2 items in the Bill of Rights that you're going to rewrite, and that's your assignment. In Vermilion Parish, Louisiana, 4th graders had workbooks that taught them Ebonics, that use terms like mobsters and po-pimp. Frankly, that's not diversity training in my book. That's not teaching people about other cultures. You can leave that off. In Albany, New York High School, those kids had an assignment, a persuasive writing assignment, to argue that Jews are evil. Use a solid rationale to convince the teacher of your loyalty to the Third Reich. Now, this was in the New York Times Union. And their article was all about the uproar that caused with parents. And the school district had to do a lot of backtracking and a lot of apologizing for that. But it happened. No cursive writing, as I said. American history begins in 1865, missing the reason for the American experiment, and American values and free market economics are not taught. There's a lot of alarm about the costs because there have been no financial assessments. Accountability Works has estimated in 2012 $16 billion price tag across the country to implement all aspects of Common Core. This summer, Wisconsin legislature had a committee that worked on estimates, and they thought their school districts could look at $62 to $256 million in costs there. Mississippi currently pays $14 a student for testing. The Brookings Institute estimates show $29.50 a student is what it will cost under par. So costs for something that's never been tested or proven, that's a really big deal. The Friends of the Common Core, there are a lot of entities that are supporting it, but probably at the top of the list is the Gates Foundation and also Pearson Publishing. And Gates has put a lot of money into it, as you can see. Bill Gates, it's important to understand about him because he's another one of those people who is not an educator, but he's involved in education. He is purchasing education and what American education should be in his view. Let's understand that in 2004, he signed an agreement with UNESCO to develop master curriculum for teacher training in technologies based on standards, guidelines, benchmarks, assessments, and techniques. And when that was signed, it was announced that UNESCO would explore how to facilitate content development. The Director General said one of his goals is fostering web-based communities of practice, including content development and worldwide curricula reflecting UNESCO values, which we know United Nations values have to do with globalist education, global government, social justice, environmental justice, all those wonderful things. Sorry, but I believe in U.S. sovereignty. I don't believe in the United Nations running my country. And here's another thing, and Angela and I talk about this all the time. Bill Gates made a speech, and it was carried in the Wall Street Journal. I think I have a link to the speech there on that thing, in which he says, we really won't know for about 10 years whether or not this educational reform project will work. There it is. And the Washington Post that carried the article says, teachers around the country are saddled every single year with teacher evaluation systems that his foundation has funded, based on no record of success and highly questionable research. And now Gates says he won't know if the reforms he's funding will work for another decade. But teachers can lose their jobs now because of reforms that he's funding. Pearson Publishing, they're an international developer of curriculum and educational materials. Prentice Hall, Scott Forsman are a couple of their big, well-known labels. They partnered with Gates on the standards development, the front end. They have $23 million at least in part contracts. They own America's Choice. Remember that America's Choice had people on the standards development team. The executive director of the Council of Chief State School Officers used to work for Pearson. So their influence is all over this. No single entity should hold that much power, that much influence over standards, curriculum, assessments, everything in the classroom. But they do. And they're on the legal hot seat in a few states for antitrust issues and for payoffs. Sir Michael Barber is the Chief Education Advisor for Pearson Publishing. He authored Deliverology 101, Delivering the Global Phenomenon of Education Reform. And Barber has said, if you want irreversible reforms, work on the culture and the minds of the teachers and the parents. And he is a proponent of Agenda 21 and the United Nations agenda. Louis Gershner was co-chairman of Achieve Incorporated in its early years. He is a very accomplished businessman. He is credited with turning around IBM. He also was a high-level executive for American Express. He's been on a lot of boards. He's the co-author of a book called Reinventing Education, Entrepreneurship in America's Public Schools. He has a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth in engineering and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. And as I said, he's a very accomplished businessman. I couldn't find anything in his background or education that tells me he's an expert in education. But in 2008, he made a speech. Wall Street Journal carried an article where he recommended some things to President Obama about education. First, abolish all school districts, but save 70 of them, one for each state and 20 for the largest cities. establish a national set of standards for core curriculum, a national skills day, when every 6th, 9th, 12th grader and 3rd grader would be tested against those standards, establish national standards for teacher certification, require reevaluation of their skills, and extend the school day and the school year to add 20 more days a year for K through 12. And this is Dr. Carrie Wright, our new state school superintendent, who I believe starts her job on Monday. I went to her press conference when she was introduced, and she said that she's a huge advocate of Common Core. And she touted that she has worked with David Coleman in Columbia, Maryland. She says that Mississippi is fortunate to be in the PARC Consortium. And she supports state-funded 4-year-old kindergarten and assessments upon entry in kindergarten. I'm sorry.
3 and 4.
3 and 4?
3. There's 3.
Some of the entities, these are conservative policy groups and think tanks, Heritage Foundation and Pioneer Institute, as I mentioned, American Association of Christian Schools, the Republican National Committee. There's a copy of the resolution that they passed at their spring meeting, the Republican National Committee, opposing Common Core. I have a few up here if you'd like to have one. Dr. James Milgram, Dr. Sandra Stotsky both oppose it. They were on the validation committee for the standards in math and English language arts. Dr. Milgram said in an article with School Reform News, the facilitators for the validation committee meeting were virtually impossible to deal with. The facilitators were emphatically trying to not let us act according to our charter, but simply sign or not sign an approval letter when the charter said we had final say over the quality of the final standards and could revise or rewrite them. Of course, Dr. Milgram did not sign the approval letter. Dr. Stotsky said the Common Core language arts standards will lead to a lower level of literacy for all high school students. Grade level standards are mostly language skill sets with little substantive content. I'm sure that Senator Hill will talk about what she thinks we need to do here in Mississippi. A number of other states have withdrawn from all the whole Common Core initiative. Some have withdrawn just from PARC. A number of them have pending legislation to do that. Recently, the governor of Iowa signed a declaration or an executive order saying that he rejects all federal standards in his state. I got to tell you, this is a spiritual battle. We don't battle against flesh and blood. And so we need to be on our knees about this. We really need to pray for our legislators, that God would give them wisdom. You know, they can't know everything about everything. And those guys and gals that are up there serving right now, a lot of them weren't there when Common Core was adopted. And the ones that were didn't know what was happening. But it's our job to let them know. So you need to educate yourself. You need to engage policymakers. You need to pay attention to what your children are bringing home from school. And when my daughter told me about the bluest eye and that Madison had read it, I said, I hope you were down there at that principal, that superintendent's office, telling them how you felt about that. And she said, no, sadly, I didn't do it. But in hindsight, she knows that she really should have. And I'll see to it that she does if it ever happens again. So you got to attend meetings, the PTA meetings, and school board meetings. I wonder how many. We need to start going to school board meetings, local and state. We need to talk to elected officials. So